Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where we take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of Big Finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week. And today, on the 3rd of October 2019, I'm starting to look at the first part of the first story in the two-part finale for Series 6 of the Fourth Doctor Adventures, and the second-to-last Tom Baker audio we will actually be looking at. Marc Platt's The Skin of the Sleek. Starting with part 1. Now, this is actually, I think, the first story we're covering that Marc Platt wrote completely. He did help with adapting some of Philip Hinchcliffe's work to audio, but this is what he does on his own. And he's actually one of my favorite Doctor Who writers overall. He eventually does write for the TV series itself much later on, and then he does quite a lot of Big Finish, which we will be covering quite a lot of it much sooner, actually. But The Skin of the Sleek Part 1 has a very... What draws me to it is the very interesting tone that the story kind of goes for. There's this planet where it feels very much like this is a story about Vikings. I think it's about sort of like space Vikings, which is, okay, you have primitive planets that live in this swamp, and it just something feels very Norse about it, which is an interesting way of looking at the story. Sort of just a quote unquote Norse type mythology as the story goes. But what it is that this entire planet has this, like, storyteller who sees into the future, sort of like an oracle. And then they basically, the big twist at the end of the episode is they get fed to this giant eel, like this mother sleek, which is, so like the sleek are these like electric eel type things that the people of this world, it sustains them. They eat it, which is perfectly fine. It's a perfectly interesting idea, and then they nail the skins right to the wall, which is where you get the title, The Skin of the Sleek, which I think there's more to it than that this first episode doesn't quite go into, but that's how it starts, and it starts off really, really well. There's a lot to enjoy in this first episode here. You have the characters really sparking off each other, and the setting itself is a lot of fun. And Marc Platt does an excellent job of building up the setting and building up that this is that this is the type of story he's telling. He's telling a type of story with with a lot of gusto and a lot of and a lot of thought into it. And that's all fine. I think perhaps he should have maybe gotten to the plot a little sooner, because there's some, maybe a little too much time taken with getting to the actual plot of the story, instead of, dealing with the characters and dealing with things like that. But the plot itself is fairly, it's a good plot. It's a decent start to the plot. We really start the story off with a nice, huge, I don't want to say a bang, but with a sense of, here's where we're going, here's what the story is, here's what we're trying to do with the story, and here's what we're doing something very, very interesting. Now, Marc Platt also, gets the Doctor and Romana involved immediately. Obviously, it's a swamp. Now, what's interesting is the Doctor actually gets lost in the swamp and sort of gets himself... he doesn't get himself captured. He more just gets himself injured, which is a very interesting way of doing it for the Doctor, because it doesn't really sideline the Doctor. Tom Baker is obviously having a lot of fun with the story, um, and is doing a lot to really get the story going and giving sort of 110%. Um, I mean, it's clear that he really is enjoying himself in the role. Um, uh, but this is actually on a bigger level. It's a story about Romana, something that actually I think none of the audios and none of the show really ever has done a adequate job of doing a story about Romana, and that is because Romana is a character who you just she's kind of there. Uh, she's the Doctor's equal, and she and the Doctor have great chemistry. It's always a lot of fun when they're working together, but they don't necessarily, create a full plot and a full story together. They just don't. It's genuinely quite, it's she hasn't got much depth, but so what Marc Platt does is he introduces this character of Sartia, played by Joanna Tinsey, who basically was a friend of Romana's at the academy, and they got into trouble. There's like this very deep bond. I know some people have gone so far as to ship them, and I can see why. It's they're very close friends. They've lived, they're basically coming back together after years apart, so to speak, which is a great, which it makes for some great storytelling, and some great drama, and Tinsey and Ward have an amazing chemistry together. They really make each other, and this is where the story really shines. It's where the episode kind of shows that this is trying to be something a bit more deep and a bit more meaningful for the characters. It's not necessarily doing simple storytelling, and it's something that Marc Platt excels at. Now, again, I think the problem is episode is a bit bloated. That things could have been maybe pared down a little, and we could have actually maybe gotten to the story a bit quicker, because that is where the story does kind of lose me just a little bit, in that it doesn't go quickly enough for my liking. It needed a little more time to try to get things basically to where they could where they could finish, and finish as a story. But still, it's a good start, and it definitely shows. One, it not only does it show promise, but it shows what really what the characters are going through. What a lot of the story kind of means. It's really, really, really enjoyable. So overall, I'm going to give The Skin of the Snake Part 1 an 8 out of 10. Alright, it is the 4th of October 2019, and I just finished listening to Part 2 of The Skin of the Sleek. I have some things to say about this one, but I'm not quite sure where I want to begin. I will say, Marc Platt does an excellent job of doing a story that is thematically, and that's just not only thematically, but just incredibly deep. It's a story all about basically how the characters interact with each other, and how they and basically sort of there's a lot of stuff about the culture of this planet hidden in this story, and just a lot of stuff that the story does well is done really, really well. It's all done in aid of trying to tell a plot about these characters doing these things, in basically a linear fashion. Um, you have I'm gonna I think perhaps I should, you know, uh, you know, perhaps, um, perhaps I should talk about, uh, um, perhaps I should talk about, um, Linus first, who is the son of the Scald, who is basically meant to. He's basically meant to be the character who tells the future. Um, and this entire episode, the entire story, I didn't touch on it in part one because it wasn't as prominent there. But here, he really comes into his own as he kind of, kind of goes towards a, goes to a story where um, you really have a sense, um, a sense of people, his entire society turning on him because he can't predict the future well, and even though he can't, well, and which is interesting, but also there's also the implication that even though he can't do the uh, he can't do the predictions well. His father had predictions that are slowly coming true, and basically the the characters are um, basically he's being socially outcast while the predictions are coming true. Like the idea was the doctor would come and he's there. These little predictions that sort of are shrouded in mystery. They aren't quite explained. I think it's probably going to be explained by a surprise. It's actually a sci-fi thing, which I won't complain about because that is, you know, perfectly fine for a story like this, is to do um something like that. Um, it's it's really interesting the way that it's done in this story. Um, is that the characters are, you know, they're most definitely there doing stuff, um, but um, but it's one of those things where you don't necessarily get the most interesting stuff about the story. You get this character trying to be good, but kind of kind of failing it, at it, which is really really interesting. And on the other hand, the Doctor's basically a side player in this. Um, there's a lot of commentary between Romana and Sartia about who the Doctor is and sort of how the Doctor lives in infamy. Uh, you know, just as a character, because, you know, he's a character who does kind of live on as this mysterious figure who's basically a you know, who's basically one of those characters who really uh, really um, uh, you know, there is um, there is. There's this. Um, there's just this big. There's this big conclusion here as you have Sardia actually turning against Romana, which is a very emotional scene, because you sort of get the real sense that, well, the Doctor's a legend. Romana is kind of a character who's always been too prideful, which is a really interesting way of doing Romana as a character, is that she is kind of prideful, and that's something that the story itself does a really good job of sort of exploring. That being said, it's a great episode. So much so that I'm going to give The Skin of the Sleek Part 2 a 9 out of 10. That being said, we add up the scores and average to give The Skin of the Sleek a final score of 8.5 out of 10. Thank you everybody once again for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon, and as always, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and join me next time for our 200th episode and the final Tom Baker audio with The Thief Who Stole Time.